Hi, this is Paul Boreen welcoming you to episode 4 of Religion Then and Now. This is a podcast where we look at the biblical roots of Judaism and Christianity and look deep into God's commands about religion that have been ignored for lack of understanding of mysteries, parables, and symbols. The title of this podcast is Part 3 of Understanding Demons, Devils, Satan's Evil Spirits, and Antichrists. If you have not yet listened to parts 1 and 2 of this series, I strongly suggest that you do that before listening to this episode. But I will give you a short review. In parts 1 and 2, I said that demons, devils, Satan's evil spirits, and antichrists are not real. I said that they are symbolic representations of religious leaders whom we otherwise identify as pastors, priests, rabbis, apostles, prophets, bishops, elders, deacons, overseers, popes, missionaries, theologians, and other religious leaders. I said that biblical references to these fearsome mythical creatures are God's way of telling us to avoid false prophets. And I said that if you really want to understand demons, devils, Satan's, and evil spirits, you would first need to reject what you've been taught and believed about the legitimacy and truthfulness of religious leaders who presume to teach you about God. So you are probably wondering, why does God want us to reject religious leaders? You will say, don't we need them to teach us, lead us in worship, and perform needed ministry? Yes, these are the things that religious leaders do, but, and here's something religious people don't understand, religious leaders do what they do on their own authority and for their own selfish, greedy, prideful reasons. They are not chosen, called, or instructed by God to do the religious things that they do. They learn to do what they do from the literal words of the Bible and from what they have learned from generations of religious people. So the answer to your question about needing religious leaders for teaching, leading in worship and performance of religious ministry and sacraments is that God is perfectly capable of doing these things without the assistance of religious leaders. So if you believe in a big God, all-powerful God, you would do well to give him credit for him being able to teach you and minister to you on his own without the help of anyone. In other words, he does not need, nor does he want, any help from religious leaders. Furthermore, he strongly and jealously resents all efforts by religious leaders to insert themselves in his place as your personal teacher and minister to your heart. And as I said earlier, when a religious leader, great or small, with a title or without a title, inserts himself or herself in God's place as teacher or minister to your heart, God considers that religious leader to be his enemy and your enemy, just like you consider demons, devils, Satan's evil spirits, and antichrists to be your enemies. Those religious leaders are God's enemies because they willfully and aggressively insert themselves between you and him. In effect, they are idols. And those religious leaders are your enemies because they successfully deceive, tempt, and entrap you in religious systems that depend on them for teaching. And they are your enemies because they deceive you with teaching that says you need them to know God, instead of teaching you to listen to God's voice. And when you listen to and follow the religious teachings, you in effect are idolaters. If you can accept this idol and idolater relationship, you're beginning to understand religion as God sees it. You're beginning to understand why God uses the symbolism of demons, devils, Satan's evil spirits, antichrists, false prophets, and idols to represent religious leaders. Up to now, you were always taught to embrace religious leaders as legitimate, even godly people whom you need to teach you about God. But now you are beginning to see religious leaders as God's enemies and as your enemies. Before you heard this podcast, most of you had no doubt about the legitimacy of religious leaders. But now you are learning, slowly perhaps, but learning nonetheless, that religious leaders are not your friends. They are not kind, sacrificial servants sent by God. Rather, they are self-serving, greedy, proud, and abusive. That's how God sees them. And the sooner you see them as He sees them, the sooner you will avoid them like you would avoid demons, evil spirits, and a deadly plague. Here's another important thing you need to know about how God sees religious leaders. When you listen to religious leaders and follow their teachings, you put them in the place of God in your hearts. In effect, you worship them. They are idolatrous gods, and you are an idolater if you willingly and eagerly seek them out for instruction about religious matters. They are religious prostitutes whom you seek, and to whom you pay money, in exchange for the false, shallow, fleshly intimacy you experience when your intellectual minds rejoice to hear human teaching based on the literal words of the Bible. Here is another truth that you must hope to understand. God insists on being the only one who teaches people about Him. He does not want any human person to teach you about Him and His ways. When you hear that, you might say that God is rigid or strict in His insistence, that He alone teaches you what you need to know about Him. But if you think about it, you would probably want to speak for yourself instead of depending on someone else to describe deep, heartfelt truths about you. This is how God feels when people who do not really know Him try to explain Him and His ways to others. Just as no one knows you better than you do, no one knows God better than God does. If you really want to know God, doesn't it make sense to let Him teach you directly with His own voice, rather than listening to someone who only knows the little they read about God in the Bible? And that is why He insists on being the one who explains His laws, His ways, and His heart to others. He doesn't want anyone else to try to explain the full depth of who He is to anyone. Most people believe that religious leaders know a lot more about God than they do. Religious people believe this because religious leaders have successfully convinced the people who follow them that leaders are a special class of people with advanced knowledge of God. The truth is that they only know just a tiny bit about God. And the little knowledge they do have is limited to the few words of the literal Bible that they understand with their intellectual minds. I have to tell you that if you don't believe that God is much bigger, much more complicated than what you read in the Bible, you believe in a very small God. And that is why He tells us in the Bible that if we want to understand the deep things of God, we must listen to His spoken voice, which we hear in our hearts, not in our intellectual minds, not in church, not in synagogues, not at conferences, not in books, and not in music. Religion appeals to our human physical capabilities, such as our intellectual mind, our natural eyes and ears, and our human emotions. Religion is also attractive to us because it provides many opportunities to do religious things with our physical bodies. This appeal is totally different from the way God works. His appeal always has been and always will be to our spiritual hearts. God never tries to appeal to our intellectual understanding of the literal words of the Bible, or what we can do with our physical bodies, or to our emotions. He calls all of these activities unclean flesh. And He calls people who promote fleshly activity to learn about Him or worship Him with their physical bodies false prophets, demons, devils, Satans, evil spirits, and antichrists. I think this is a good place to end this podcast. Before I sign off, however, I want to remind you to visit www.thewaywesee.com/links, where you will find many study resources that will give you the biblical foundation for this podcast. I also want to suggest that you share this podcast with a religious friend, family member, or religious leader. If they're religious at all, they need to hear this. Share it, even if you don't agree with what you've heard. It is sure to inspire a lively discussion. Until the next episode, this is Paul Breen saying thanks for listening to Religion Then and Now.